Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Amonette. I'm a research soil chemist and hold a joint appointment with Washington State University and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in Richland, Washington. The last 20 years of my career have been largely devoted to finding ways to store carbon in soil, and 15 of those years have specifically focused on biochar as one of the best ways of doing so. Today, I'm going to talk about the Biomass to Biochar Maximizing the Carbon Value workshop, which was organized by Washington State University earlier this year. My presentation will discuss the major funding priorities identified by the workshop participants and will be followed by 5 shorter presentations that introduce specific funding concepts identified by the working groups in the workshop. My talk will consist of 3 parts. First, I'll give an overview of the Biomass to Biochar Maximizing the Carbon Value workshop, touching on the motivation, goals, and approach taken. The bulk of my talk will focus on the major funding recommendations emanating from the workshop. This will include an overview, after which I will drill down into 2 topics proposed by the workshop: the long-term multi-site coordinated research program and the Endowment for Biochar-Based Community Development. I will close the talk by providing some information about the workshop report and the specific funding proposals from working groups that will be discussed in the talks that follow. For the remainder of my presentation, I will turn off the camera so that the entire slide can be seen. Now, as we know, biochar has tremendous potential to do a lot of different things. It can improve forest health, can decrease wildfire risk, and by so doing, it can improve air quality. It can also increase soil health and productivity. It can revitalize rural communities. And last but not least, it can draw down carbon from the atmosphere. And the real question that's formed the basis and the inspiration for this workshop was, how do we capture the synergy from all these different potential applications and benefits of biochar and maximize the value from the biochar? The goals of the workshop were 3. First, we wanted to assess the current state of the biochar industry. And then we wanted to identify barriers to growth as a sustainable carbon drawdown technology. And once we had identified these barriers that were preventing the growth, we wanted to recommend breakthrough level funding strategies that would address those barriers. We approached the workshop by inviting 36 biochar practitioners, engineers, and scientists, primarily from the Western U.S., ostensibly to participate in a 4-day in-person workshop consisting of a mixture of plenary sessions and breakout sessions. COVID-19 intervened, however, and we ended up conducting the workshop entirely in a virtual mode. To facilitate interaction and ensure that everyone's voice was heard, we placed the participants into 5 working groups distinguished on the basis of feedstock, production scale, and intended biochar use. Working groups 1 through 3 involved woody biomass feedstocks, but production at different scales. Working group 1, for example, focused on place-based on-site production of biochar using small portable kilns, with application of the biochar to the land from which the feedstock was obtained. Working group 2 focused on moderate-scale distributed production using, for example, mobile pyrolyzers located at forest landings where thinning operations were being conducted. Working Group 3 focused on large-scale production at fixed centralized facilities, such as the bioenergy plants converted to produce biochar that you may have heard about in other presentations at this forum. The remaining 2 working groups were distinguished by the use to which biochar was put. Working Group 4 looked at the production of biochar from woody biomass salvaged from municipal waste streams and its incorporation into composting operations where it has the potential to speed up the composting process while decreasing emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. Working Group 5 looked at agricultural use of biochar made from both woody biomass and agricultural feedstocks such as crop residues and manures. Elsewhere in this forum, you may have heard about non-agricultural uses of biochar, for example, as a substitute for asphalt in road paving mixtures and as a substitute for sand aggregate in construction materials. We did not consider these uses in this workshop, although we certainly agree they can add value and expand the overall storage capacity available for biochar. The virtual workshop was held in April of 2020, and working groups continued to meet throughout the summer to refine their thinking and to write chapters summarizing their funding priorities. The full workshop report is expected to be available at the end of 2020 or in early January 2021. This slide provides an overview of the 4 major funding recommendations resulting from this workshop. Starting at the bottom, we recommend funding a long-term coordinated research and development effort to provide the basic engineering and scientific knowledge needed to support the development of a sustainable biochar industry. In the blue triangular section above, there are 3 closely related funding priorities that are directly linked to biochar industry development. These include near-term market-focused research and development, business support infrastructure, and collaborative policy development. On the left side of the diagram, we show how scientific and engineering knowledge feeds market development, which in turn helps the industry. On the right side, we show the essential need for stakeholder engagement and public support. We need to communicate the science, listen to stakeholder and public concerns, and work collaboratively to develop the policies needed to make the sustainable biochar industry develop. So just to summarize the major funding priorities here in text, the first one is the long-term multi-site coordinated program resolves key knowledge gaps related to production use and climate impact. Number 2 focuses on near-term market-focused research to address regional biochar concepts and applications. Number 3 strengthens the infrastructure to support businesses, and this includes financial tools and incentives, a trained workforce, and customer engagement. And the 4th funding priority would be directed towards collaboratively developed environmental regulations and ecosystem service pricing policies that align with biochar technology. So shifting to the long-term multi-site coordinated research and development, we look at this in 3 different areas. First, there are a series of research topics, and these are both on the engineering side and on the biophysical processes side. So in engineering, we have biomass harvest and handling. We have biochar production, handling, and post-processing issues. We look at the capture and use of bioenergy during the production of biochar, and we look at the different ways in which biochar can be applied. In the biophysical processes side, we focus more on the climate economic impacts of biochar application and the scientific results of this. So not only are we concerned with climate per se, but we're also concerned with things like crop production when biochar is applied to agronomic lands, and also when biochar is applied to forested lands and rangelands. What are the impacts of this, and where does it make sense to do it, and how do we do it best? So we have several different areas under there, looking at things like compost and manure management issues, applications in agriculture, forestry, horticulture, and grassland situations. These research topics will be addressed through a series of geographically distributed field sites. All the sites would study and optimize the use of biochar in different situations. The sites highlighted in orange would also involve the optimization of biochar production from local sources of biomass. The dark blue site would include engineering work to develop ways of applying biochar to grasslands. To illustrate the concept, we've identified specific locations in the U.S. for each of these sites, but the same approach could be applied if this program were to have an international focus. The second part of our long-term coordinated research and development effort involves the development of models. And here we start with some fundamental pyrolysis models that are needed to help in the design of reactors and in the engineering of these reactors at multiple scales. So both we would go even down to things like the simple portable kilns, all the way up to the more elaborate and expensive pyrolysis systems, such as might be used at a fixed location or a mobile pyrolyzer. The second type of model would involve supply chain optimization. And an example of this was given yesterday in a talk by Johannes Lehmann, where they looked at siting of biochar production facilities in relation to feedstock supply and biochar need. So the feedstocks were located, I believe, more in the northern part of the state of Georgia, and whereas most of the need for the biochar being produced was down in the southwestern part of the state. And so these models would optimize placement of facilities, geographic location. The third type of model is what we would basically call response models, and these come in several different flavors. First, we were dealing with the response of plants to biochar applications. And this is an example of where we look at what kind of agronomic yields do we get as a result of applying biochar to different types of soil. What happens when you apply biochar in a forest situation or a rangeland situation, or even in a horticultural situation where you're growing vegetables for market. The next type of response model is basically what we would call a life cycle assessment that includes the production side as well as the performance side of the biochar technology. And so we're looking here at greenhouse gas emissions, the overall carbon footprint, that sort of thing. Then we move to what we call techno-economic assessments, which look at the technical and economic aspects of implementing a particular biochar technology in a particular location. And this helps guide the further development of the industry. The next level of model is a macroeconomic scenario where we roll up a lot of these techno-economic assessments and put them into a model that may model feed into models for the economy of the country and would aid in the design of, say, congressional bills and government policies to help promote biochar industry. And finally, we want to integrate particularly the life cycle assessment, but all of these into global models that predict climate change scenarios. Biochar is one of the negative emission technologies recognized by the IPCC, and by integrating with the global models, we further get biochar, we find out what it can and can't do and what its ultimate impact can be on a global scale. The third part of our long-term multi-site coordinated research and development project would involve the function of knowledge consolidation and outreach. Basically, what we would be doing is taking the information generated in other parts of the project, the modeling and the basic scientific and engineering information, that would be summarized in the form of technical reports and scientific publications, and putting them online in an information clearinghouse, much as a library would do. We would also summarize this information in a series of best management practices in a variety of formats. All of this would be made available free of charge. And finally, we would conduct interactive outreach involving workshops, webinars. We would have education, discussion, and sharing of concerns with interested parties, and the development of new concepts. Now, much of this activity is already being conducted by the existing organizations out there, such as the United States Biochar Initiative and the International Biochar Initiative. Our focus here would be to complement what they are doing, to work with them, and basically to find a way to get the information that we are generating on this project into their worlds as well. This slide summarizes the structure of the proposed research and development project. And in addition to the technical tasks down below, which we've discussed in the previous slides, engineering and biophysical processes, model development, and knowledge consolidation and outreach, we also show a program management function and assisted by an advisory council. The advisory council is a very important part of this because it would involve both technical expertise as well as stakeholder input and public input. It would ensure that whatever we end up doing is valued by the public and meets concerns of stakeholders. So I would envision probably half the members of the advisory council would not be technically biochar savvy so much as providing other viewpoints, much as a board of directors would in a well-run corporation. So how much is this thing going to cost? Well, we're estimating about $150 to $200 million a year during the first decade. And then 40 to $50 million a year for the longer term, basically where you have biochar experiments going on in the field, and they just need to be maintained and data collected and processed, but you're not starting necessarily any new initiatives. And this works out over 50 years to about $3 to $4 billion. Okay, it sounds like real money actually, but if you look at it from the standpoint of the estimated cost of drawdown, where we're looking at on the order of 1,000 gigatons of CO2 being drawn down at, let's say, $200 a ton over 100 to 200 years, you're talking $200 trillion. And so 3 to 4 billion is pretty small change compared to the cost of drawdown, and anything we can do to improve the efficiency of that drawdown will more than pay for this research. And of course, if you look at unabated climate change, the cost of that, I don't even want to try and calculate. The scope of the project, I've framed it here as being a United States scope, but it could just as easily be international or both. We're looking at it being sponsored through a combination of public and private entities. An example of where this sort of thing has been done and is being done is the Consortium for International Agricultural Research Centers, CGIAR, which serves as a possible model. And of course, we would leverage all the existing programs. There's a strong program at USDA ARS already looking at biochar and with many field sites ongoing. And so we would tie in and leverage off of those. So back to the major funding recommendations. Now I want to shift to the triangular area of this plot and look at the three different sectors in there: near-term market-focused research and development, business support infrastructure, and collaborative policy development. So the near-term market-focused research would focus on developing biochar protocols and specifications so that you have a known quantity, the customer knows what they're getting, they know how to use it, and we make sure that it's being used in a proper way. He would develop measurements of environmental emission factors during production and refine the algorithms used by regulatory agencies to do that. It would develop algorithms and assess market values for different types of ecosystem services provided by biochar. And it would conduct pilot studies and demonstrations for regional market development. And examples of this include prescriptive applications in agriculture and forestry with high return potential, fire hazard reduction projects, land reclamation and restoration projects, looking at co-composting of waste streams from municipal and agricultural sources, environmental filtration, and development of high-value carbon-based materials. The second part of the industry portion of our recommendation involves developing infrastructure to support business. Here we look at three different areas. Activities to foster business formation involves establishing a forum for entrepreneurial connections to be made between innovative practitioners and people who want to provide money to support them to develop their idea. We would find a way to develop and share business tools that are specific to biochar. Third, we'd look at guidance with respect to technical and regulatory issues. And lastly, we would find a way to develop better access to capital and development of creative financial and sales instruments. I'll talk about that a little bit later. In addition to these activities, we would want to train a diverse workforce. We know there's a wide range of skills needed in the biochar industry, and the types of training that would be involve internships, on-the-job training, and formal education ranging from high school all the way through graduate school. And lastly, we saw the need to develop customer awareness. So we need to engage with stakeholders. We need to survey them, understand the current barriers to biochar production and use the results of these surveys to guide near-term research and product development efforts, and then design and conduct marketing campaigns that would be aimed at wholesale and retail customers. In the third of the biochar industry focused areas of priority, We are focused on collaborative policy development, and the overall goals of this would be to mitigate climate change and the benefits of provide ecosystem services, and also to revitalize rural communities economically by the development of a sustainable biochar industry. So here we look at two different aspects of it. One is developing price support for ecosystem services. And under the rubric of climate change mitigation, of course, we're talking things like carbon credits and things of that nature. But in soil health, air quality, and human health and water storage, each of these ecosystem services have value to society. And the purpose of this particular effort would be to make sure that society in turn finds a way to fund these so that they are actually performed and done. And then the other area which we'd focus on in this policy development is the development of appropriate environmental permitting instruments. And these are chiefly aimed at emissions during biochar production. The industry currently faces some pretty steep hurdles, particularly with the smaller scale production, of having to apply for Title V permits from the EPA in order to be able to produce. And at the same time, if you were to take the same biomass and make a pile and burn it, you would have a whole different level of permitting, which much less onerous. And so the idea here is basically to make sure that the environmental permits are appropriate and make sure that we're achieving the goals we want. Because if we end up going with just pile burning as an approach to eliminating biomass, we end up with lower carbon yield in the biochar, and we end up with more pollution in the atmosphere than we would by using more modern techniques for making biochar. So the idea is to ease this approach so that it's more economically feasible for all and achieves the benefits and protects the public at the same time. We would implement this policy development by a collaborative process. It would be led by biochar industry trade organizations such as the USBI and the IBI. It would involve educating and engaging with stakeholders, developing some sort of consensus that would lead to a formal policy. And then you form coalitions to promote this policy and lobby for the change that's needed. And ultimately, this is how the development of the policy succeeds. So this third area here with the triangle basically needs some glue to hold it together. And that's what this blue triangle in the center is designed to represent. And that glue consists of two different areas, two different types of institutions actually. One, we have biochar industry trade organizations such as the International Biochar Initiative and the US Biochar Initiative, and various regional industry organizations such as the Sonoma Biochar Initiative and so on. And we need to strengthen these, and they can continue their roles of defining the industry needs, developing the policies, and engaging with stakeholders. But we also feel that there's a need for a new entity that will focus more on the financial aspects of biochar development. And this, we think, would take the form of an endowment for biochar-based community development. This primary emphasis of this endowment would be the development of small biochar-based businesses in rural communities. And it would be modeled after the United States Endowment for Forestry and Communities. Its role would be to provide financial support for policy development, building in business infrastructure, and near-term research and development activities. Those three areas we have in that triangular section in the center of our diagram. Things like developing a revolving fund to loan capital, finance purchase orders, and provide short-term operating loans to biochar businesses. A way of catalyzing funding for near-term research and development projects. It could serve as a conduit for philanthropic funding. It could provide matching funds to things like the USBI and the IBI, as well as other biochar researchers, to enable them to participate in federal and state grants that have that requirement. and it could provide seed money for promising new concepts. So I've indicated that the glue that holds this industry development part of our funding recommendations together are the International Biochar Initiative, the U.S. Biochar Initiative, and the Endowment for Biochar-Based Community Development. Moving on to the last part, where we're talking about outreach. The projects and concepts developed by the workshop, Biomass to Biochar, Maximizing the Carbon Value, will be available in a report which will be published online by the end of the year or early 2021. It'll be available at the Center for Sustaining Agricultural and Natural Resources at WSU on their publications library. I have the link here. And we've just converged on a cover picture so you can see kind of what the cover of this report's going to look like. And I encourage you, if you need further information about this report, feel free to contact me or Georgine Yorgi or Karen Hills as listed on the slide. This work was supported in part by funding from the U.S. Forest Service Wood Innovations Grant Program, by the State of Washington Department of Ecology Waste to Fuels Technology Partnership, and by the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. I say in part because there was a tremendous amount of volunteer work on the part of participants in the workshop as well as the organizers to make this all happen. So together with the funding we received, we're very grateful for the work that was done by all to make this happen. Now here I want to highlight the following 5 presentations that focus on the recommendations, specific recommendations by the working groups. We gave them a charge to come up with their best project concept that could be achieved in a matter of, say, 3 to 5 years, maybe as long as 10 years. And so each of them came up with a specific proposal or group of proposals to develop biochar industry in their particular area. So in working group 1, Gloria Flora will be presenting that, and they will focus on the environmentally friendly, ecosystem-informed biochar kiln design for sustainable practices. Working group 2 will be presented by Jim Dooley, and he will talk about maximizing the net carbon content of biochar at distributed and community scale production sites. Working Group 3, presented by Tom Miles, will focus on the needs for building a large-scale biochar industry and a pathway to get there. Working Group 4 will be presented by Mark Fuchs, and he will discuss integrating the biochar compost industries, carbon drawdown for profit. And Working Group 5 will be presented by Kristen Tripp, and she will talk about developing a nationwide framework for evaluating and predicting agronomic responses to biochar-based amendments. I encourage you to listen to each of these 5 presentations. They give very specific cost information, time information, and the concept as well, and further amplify the overall impact of this workshop. And I thank you for your attention.